This episode was filmed during the COVID-19 pandemic, so we've taken Suds Search inside. My guest today is Susan Wenograd, CMO at Aimclear. I'm not sure I know anyone with the breadth and depth of Susan's expertise in paid media. She's a sought-after speaker, writer, and trainer on topics related to paid social, paid search, content strategy, and integrated marketing. She's one of my favorite presenters. A short list of the conferences she speaks at include the Social Media Marketing World, HubCon, Brighton, SMX, and Social Media Examiner. In addition to her role at Aimclear, Susan is a paid media reporter at Search Engine Journal. She joined me on Suds Search to talk about ways to get value out of traffic that doesn't convert, how to create an effective customer funnel, and her fondness for Disney.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great. So we have a mutual friend, Greg Gifford, recommended that I reach out to you.
Greg is everybody's friend, though. I mean, let's face it.
This is a good point. The first thing he said to ask you about is Disney. He said you're a fan of Disney.
I knew it. Yeah. We got married there, actually.
You're kidding.
So
wow.
That's like my fun fact is my husband and I got married at Disney World. So Greg teases me all the time that I'm like his Obi-Wan for anything happening at Disney. I had to learn like everything about it because we had 80 guests fly in, and you get a lot of questions about like, how do I get from this hotel to this thing? And how much does it cost to do that? And is this included? So I kind of just became this encyclopedia of knowledge about what Disney World has, because I was a kind of an event coordinator temporarily for our wedding.
Wow. I asked him if you were as big a fan of Disney as he was, and he said, you're way beyond. And so
he's a big Star Wars guy. So he's got me beat on the Star Wars front. We just kind of fell into it because it's where we got, like, we were both kind of fans. I mean, I went there when I was a kid, and my husband went to Disneyland. And then what started it was just that, you know, our family lives everywhere. So when we got married in 2012, it was going to be a destination wedding no matter where we went. I mean, we were like, everyone's going to have to travel. We don't have like a home base of operation, so to speak. So I had a friend that got married there, and she loved it, and the pictures were beautiful. And I said to him, like, that would be really fun. Like, most everybody is married and they have kids. So if they want to make it a trip, they can. Right. So most people came and just stayed the week, and they made a family vacation out of it. So it was really fun to see like all the photos that everybody took of the stuff they did while they were there. And I mean, it was obviously a blast. We had such a good time. So it was awesome. It makes me sad that it's closed right now.
Oh yeah, I know. I am going to start asking you about paid search and social. This is not just about Disney.
I know as much about Disney too. So
one of the things that's interesting, I started as a paid search analyst. That was my first job in 2007. So we started around the same time. And this kind of, and then I drifted over more into SEO.
You went to the dark side.
I went to the dark side, yeah. This idea of like a PPC analyst, or it really is more of a paid media. That's really what's changed a lot.
Yeah.
And maybe give your background and how you ended up being able to have this breadth of knowledge about Google ads, paid social, video ads.
Yeah. If I was starting today, I wouldn't know all this. I think it's like that saying about like when you throw the frog into a pot of hot water versus like when he's in it, you slowly turn up the temperature. Yeah. But when I actually started in email marketing. So I actually have a background on that too. But I started doing that at circuitcity.com when they were still around. And so that was when I realized like, oh, you can see how many times people clicked on something or how many times they opened something. Like I was fascinated by the fact you could track all this. And I had originally started there as an editor. So I was a word nerd to begin with. So paid search was kind of this natural fusion of like, the fact that I liked copy, I liked words. I was very interested in like the human psychology of how people would search for things, what ads they responded to. But I liked the metrics piece. So I enjoyed it more than copywriting. So that was where I started initially. And I did paid search for, I started in 07-ish, I think. And I still do it to this day. So however old that makes me, that's how long I've been doing it. But I started to get into paid social. It was kind of funny how it happened. I'd spoken at paid search stuff a lot. Like I'd spoken at Hero Conference and, all that stuff. And I noticed that no one was talking about paid social. And it was one of those weird outliers where like, it didn't really fit in a search conference, but no one was speaking about it at any other conference. And I knew more and more paid search people were getting asked about, specifically Facebook ads was the one that people were asking about the most. And so at the time I was working in-house and I was like, we did home decor. So I was like, I got to learn how the Facebook thing works. And back then it was obviously much simpler. So I started messing around with it and I really loved it. Like I really loved the marketing piece, and it kind of took that like creative testing piece, because I'm very right and left brain equal.
That's a lot of people in search. That's what they like.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I really enjoyed doing both, and it kind of took the creative piece and put it into overdrive, because then it wasn't just text messages, it was like the visuals, and then later they added video. So I loved the breadth of creative stuff you could test. So I started just kind of learning around, tinkering with it, figuring out how it worked. No one was really talking about it that much then. So I had, search conferences that were reaching out, and they were like, well, I don't know what you want to talk about. Like, cause at that point PPC was getting pretty mature. And so I think a lot of people were talking about the same stuff over and over. And I was running into that too, where I was like, oh God, what am I going to talk about that hasn't been covered 50 million times? And I don't remember which conference it was, but I said, what if I talk about paid social instead? And they were so excited. They were like, oh my God, it was something different, right? They were just like anything. And I said, I know it's not search, but a lot of paid search people are naturally being asked about these new avenues. So it was like 2013, 2014, I guess. I did my first Facebook ads presentation. It was like super well received. And I got so many follow-ups from PPC people with questions, and questions from the audience, and emails months later from people that were there. And so it was kind of like I said with Disney World in the beginning, like I was kind of forced to get good at it, because I was like, oh, hey, I'll talk about this. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, a beacon of someone that's talking about this that can answer questions. Cool. So I started getting a lot of questions about it. So I kind of just became really good at it out of necessity, because people had really good questions and they were things I didn't know the answers to. So it just naturally fueled my curiosity. I'm like, oh, it's good. I don't know how that works. Like, let me figure it out. So I'd go in and, mess around and figure out how these things worked and what the shortcomings were and how it was different than search, and, all that stuff. So that was just kind of how I went down that road. And then just the demand was there. I mean, there was not a lot of supply for people that knew how to do it, and there was a ton of demand. So it was also just kind of a right place, right time scenario. So I've just kind of kept up with it since then.
Wow. And it is different than search. Like the psychology is different. Not just, do you feel like you're putting on a different brain when you're in ads, when you're doing Facebook and Instagram?
1,000%. It's like, in some ways I feel like you have less to work with. It's like with Facebook and Instagram, and this is something I've seen. I don't see it as much now, because I feel like the Facebook ads person has become, a skill set in its own right. But for a long time, it was the paid search person that was managing it. And I could always tell, because I'd go in and they'd have like these hyper targeted, like really like bid caps, you know what I mean? Like these super structured layouts that I knew weren't going to work well for the way that Facebook's brain works, right? So it's a shift, because everything is very transparent in Google. It's like, what each of your clicks are, exactly who you're targeting. There's just not a lot of black boxiness to it. And they're even pretty open about how the auction works, right?
Right.
Facebook, not so much. So they have so much user data that you don't have, you will never have, you're not going to see. So there's this element of having to give up that control to trust that the AI ultimately is probably going to do a lot of things better than you. It's very hard for someone that comes from paid search. It's just not in their DNA for things to work that way. And they also tend to be, they're usually a lot more math oriented. I find that Facebook ads marketers kind of have more of that creative marketing brain, whereas paid search people are kind of more that marketing analyst, numbers type of person. So they draw a little bit on different skill sets. So I found that it's definitely branched into the point where like most people do one or the other. If they do both, they'll openly admit that there's one that they don't feel more comfortable with. It just kind of depends on who the person is. So
I love that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
One example of this I can think of, you did a video recently about funnels and Instagram that was seriously, I think in the last day or two.
Yeah, I filmed it in January, but it was just released this week.
And it was really interesting, because one of the things you talked about is as a campaign objective, sometimes it's not best in we're talking about Instagram here, to choose conversions as your objective. Yeah. If you're like in paid search, it's like it's all about the conversion. We got to get the credit. We need the attribution. We got to have it.
Yep.
Why? I would encourage people to watch the full video. It's really good. But why focus on something like engagement rather than conversions?
So it kind of goes to what you were saying about how it's really a different psychology. Like when you're dealing with someone in search, they tend to be much closer to purchase. Like they're telling you, this is what I'm looking for. Right. I mean, they can't be any more direct about what it is they're looking for. So the conversion volume on that is going to be a lot higher because you know that they are at that bottom of funnel portion where like they're looking for exactly what you're selling. The challenge you have with something like paid social is that they could be anywhere in the funnel, right? Like you don't know if they're actively looking, you don't know like it, and even if you're targeting something like a lookalike audience, Facebook is still determining who these people are. So it could be because they've been browsing sites that sell that. It could be because they typed it into a text message and like DM to someone. You don't really know why they're in that group. So it's a much bigger mixed bag of people. And so when you optimize for something like conversion, it's not that the platforms don't do it well. I mean, Facebook and Instagram do a fine job of it. It's just that you're going to get mixed in with a whole lot of people that might not quite be there yet. And so it's expensive because you're basically saying, hey, I want to target this big pool of people. But as soon as you tell it to optimize for conversion, it's going to be like this much of that pool. It's like a really small amount. So it's expensive. And so you just pay a lot more I always tell people, if you're spending a lot in conversion campaigns and no one's converting, you're spending a lot of money for brand awareness at that point. It's like you're paying $22 CPMs just for people to know your brand name. So there's kind of like, you got to kind of hedge your bet of like, yes, I always run stuff that does do bottom of funnel conversion, but you have to layer that with stuff that just acknowledges the fact that not everybody's there yet, right? So it's like you may want to target those kind of similar audiences, but go for something that's a cheaper objective, like engagement, or sometimes traffic works. It sort of depends on the situation, but those things are way cheaper, so that you're capturing that top of funnel, but you're paying like $3 to $4 CPMs instead of $22 ones like you do at bottom of funnel stuff. So it's just a different sales cycle.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting thing just from a PPC or paid search side to go, if the traffic doesn't convert, it still has a lot of value. There's stuff to learn from these things. So like one of the things you wrote was about underutilizing personas in paid search. I would admit, like really for me, if it doesn't convert, it kind of just gets left on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, it's like, didn't work.
Didn't work, yeah. Like, how should people be looking at the traffic that didn't convert to make better decisions?
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite topics. Because I think it's easy to fall into that trap. Like even at, I think a lot of analysts at agencies do that too, because it's, we're hired to drive sales from this channel that we're managing, right? So it's like, you don't really think outside of it. But it's one of those things where marketing works as a big machine, right? So even though they don't convert on your channel, a lot of times they just kind of get treated as like wastewater.
Yes, I mean,
it's kind of like, they didn't convert. It's like, whatever. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no value. It's kind of like, I always say, if they made it to your site and if they did something somewhat noteworthy, like they didn't land on the site and bounce 2 seconds later, it's like the traffic that's actually engaged, there's value there, but you're just going to have to work a little harder for it. So, things like looking at how you tag your traffic. So in, a lot of times like Pinterest is very top of funnel. So, people are like, I didn't have good luck with Pinterest ads. It didn't convert anything, but that's not Pinterest's purpose. Pinterest is a discovery engine, right? So, and it's kind of the same thing with LinkedIn. Everyone's like, LinkedIn's so expensive. I couldn't justify spending it. But that's where I always tell people, like, you have to make sure you're smartly UTM tagging your stuff and then pull it cross-platform. So like you can go into Facebook and create a custom audience of everyone that came from the source of your LinkedIn ad. And then it's like yes, it's expensive, but it's like, we always say, pretend like you're just buying that data, right? So throw, 5 or 10K at LinkedIn, get everyone to a landing page, turn off the LinkedIn stuff, and then just follow up with those people ongoing because you know that you've got who you wanted. So it's like, you kind of have to use the platforms for what they're good for. It's like LinkedIn, Pinterest, great discovery engine, great way to find your demographic, probably not going to convert right away, but it doesn't mean that there's no use for them. And that's kind of, what you were saying before about how paid media people kind of have to become like these full platform stack people. Right. It's recognizing like, what is each platform good for? Like, I'm not going to go in every client and say, run ads on TikTok and run ads on Snapchat. But there are a lot of them where they actually probably would do very well. And they just don't because they fall back on things that they know are going to take credit for the conversion, whether warranted or not.
Yeah. And I would say one of the things that was interesting in the article was how easy it was to create these personas. Like people can get intimidated. I remember LinkedIn is expensive, so it can kind of be an intimidating platform, but and if it doesn't really immediately deliver ROI, it's like so easy to pull the plug.
You just want to turn it off. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And that's why I always tell people, like, follow those audiences. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. Like if you do lead gen on Facebook, right? Everyone's like, oh, the leads are trash, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but this is why I always tell people, you know, you got to think through from a marketing perspective. Like if you're going to run lead capture ads on Facebook, have it right to a separate list. Watch what that list does. Do they open your emails? Do they unsubscribe? Like you have to watch the long-term behavior. We're so conditioned, and I'm guilty of it. Like I'm not perfect, but we're so conditioned to like that immediate gratification, right? And a lot of it's not because these channels were better. It's just that there was no other measurement, right? So it was kind of like search does everything. Well, that's because we weren't really able to measure anything else, right? So now it's like we can measure all this other stuff, and we're realizing how complex the attribution actually is. And you're like, oh crap, this is not as like linear as we thought it was, right? So it's understanding like what are those things that those channels do well, and like not trying to hold them to a standard they can't attain, right? It's like you can't run something in Pinterest and be like, oh, it sucked. It's like, no, it probably did what Pinterest is good for very well. It just didn't drive a whole ton of sales because that's not what it's good at. So it's like you have to use the platforms for what they actually have strengths in. That's
so smart. I love that. One of the things that you also wrote about, we're filming this during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm not asking you a lot of questions about it, although you've written a lot about it. And so if people go to you're a columnist at Search Engine Journal.
Yeah.
If people want to know more, I really encourage them to go over there and look for everything you've written. But
it's one of the things
I believe that.
It's like breaking news every day. We're all like, oh my God, there's like 50 things happening, policies changing. It's crazy.
I know, but I do think it would be worthwhile. There's a bunch of like free stuff for different not-for-profits have some free stuff. Small, medium-sized businesses have some free stuff that they could take advantage of. There was a recent update. I think that you said it launched at the end of March, but they've been recently updated a grant from Google for SMBs.
Yeah.
It's something like 340 million.
Yeah, they're setting aside $340 million in ad credits. And so they'd announced it at the end of March, but they didn't really have a lot of details yet. They're like, details will be forthcoming. Yeah. So they finally released some of those details yesterday. They updated the help article on it. And so it basically reviews like eligibility requirements. You had to, you can't be like someone that signed up to get the credits. They're kind of protecting against that. So businesses that advertised on Google Ads 10 out of the 12 months in 2019. And they also advertised in January or February of this year. So they kind of like stopped, they knew that most people had to cut stuff off after the COVID craze sort of started. So they kind of gave you up till February. So that was kind of the eligibility piece. A lot of people are like, well, how much will I get? That's totally determined by Google. They're not disclosing that calculation. They say that it does include like your history. So I'm assuming if you've been around longer, if you spent more, how much you spend, your currency, what country you're in. So they have all these things that they're calculating and how they get that. But they're going to start rolling out the ad credits next month in May. And so they will appear just as an ad credit in your account. And they just need to be used before the end of the year. So it's actually a pretty, elastic program. I mean, it's like they're not, and they can be used for display, YouTube, or search.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a big benefit. Do people apply for this, or they're just given it?
They're just given it.
Nature?
That was kind of the other thing that was nice is I'm like, they're not making anybody apply. I think especially, employers, they're kind of over applying for things after the paycheck protection thing. I'm sure you can sympathize. So I was glad to see they're not making people like raise their hand and ask for it. They're just going to proactively start rolling it out. So you don't have to do anything. It'll just show up.
Yeah, I hate the payroll protection plan so much after all this stuff.
I've been watching what people are going through with that. Oh my gosh.
It almost informs this question. So there's $340 million earmarked for this.
Yep.
Maybe it's too in my head, the PPP, but how do they make sure that Potbellies and Ruth's Chris Steakhouse and Shake Shack and like what are big small businesses don't get all of that? Are there any protections in place?
They didn't disclose that. So my guess is there's probably I would assume that it's kind of in their algorithm. How much have they spent versus their size and what probably makes sense for them to get. I don't think that it would necessarily be maxed out on them. My guess is that they'll probably make it so there's like, it's probably a tiered distribution of like, if you spent this much, you know, between these ranges, this is what the calculation is or something like that. But yeah, I mean, it does. The other thing that they did say too is that like, if you're an advertiser that has multiple accounts, it's issued at an advertiser level. So it's not, and it's kind of the same thing if you're an agency that has an MCC, it's still on a client by client basis. So it's like, if you have 30 clients in your MCC, they're still treated as individual advertisers. They're not treated as like a roll up under your MCC that's evaluated as one package. They're evaluated as individual advertisers. So for those large companies, it'll be interesting if they have multiple accounts, you know, they're not eligible for ad credits over and over and over and over and over. You know what I mean? They're eligible as a single entity.
All right, very cool.
Yeah.
And then just one last question. You're well known as a speaker and presenter at conferences all over the world. How has life been being quarantined here?
It's actually been a lot simpler. I always know what time zone I'm in, so that's always been interesting. I had a stint in November where interestingly, I had to go to Milan, which has been, you know, the epicenter in Europe of where all this started. So it was weird to see the news, like all the places I went when I was there just deserted. But I was literally there one week. I had the worst travel experience of my life, had to fly back. I was home for 2 days and then I had to go all the way to Portland, and I'm based in Virginia. So it was like, it was tied with the year before where I had to go from Portland home and then to Ireland. So it's been nice because I kind of like, I know what time zone I'm in. I feel like I'm able to devote a lot more time to the writing and stuff that I really enjoy. Not that I don't enjoy speaking, but I kind of gone into this year saying I'm going to cut my conference schedule in half because I really want to produce more content. It's more scalable. It reaches more people. So this just kind of accelerated that, unbeknownst to us. But I mean, it's been kind of nice to be home, but I miss the audience interaction. Like I like being able to get questions on the fly. It kind of helps me know where people are getting stuck. How are the platforms changing in ways that I might not see in day-to-day management or that our team isn't seeing? So there's facets like that I miss. I miss kind of being able to just see what's happening, especially on the search side. I tend to know a lot of people in SEO. So it's interesting to kind of hear what's happening in their world. I feel a little out of touch with that just because I'm kind of limited just reading articles. And then if I don't understand half of the coding language in it, I'm like, I can't raise my hand and be like, I'm a non-coder. Can you put that in plain terms? So I miss that. I miss the give and take of that.
I believe it.
Yeah.
Well, Susan, it was really great to have you on.
Yes, thanks for having me.
I barely even mentioned the Suds, but I want to cheers virtually. I know we're going across state lines. I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
And we'll hopefully I'll see you when things open up at a conference somewhere. And
yeah, I'll be back out there at some point. We'll see. It might not be till next year at this rate. I don't know. We'll have to see who winds up having to still, you know, be able to have their conference and who just has to put it on hold indefinitely.
I'll look out for conferences in Orlando or Disneyland. Or
I always wish they'd have them there more. They never have them in Orlando. And I'm like, man, I've got an annual pass. I could just hop over there for the day, but not happening this year.
Pass. Maybe this is an idea for a conference we could talk about sometime.
I'm telling you, they're missing out. I'm like, how can you not have a conference at like Coronado Springs? The whole search industry would come. There's a ton of Disney fans in the search industry.
So, well, thanks again, Susan. Appreciate you coming on, and we'll see you on the next episode of Suds Search.